my dears, welcome to a video. Oh god. Hi! We're going to talk about how therapy operates under capitalism because that's a conversation I've been having a lot with my friends lately and also seeing circulate on the social medias, and I wanted to learn more about it, so here we are. I want to give the disclaimer. I'm not a medical professional. I have a degree in psychology with a thesis focused on mental disability and accessible education. I also am a disabled person who grew up within various sectors of the medical system, but I do not speak here as a medical professional at all whatsoever, nor do I claim to. Most of what's in this video is collated from folks with doctorates, with a particular emphasis on queer doctors, trans doctors, and BIPOC doctors, all of which will be linked in the description below. Per usual, check out other sources. They're fantastic. Also, I am not here to say that therapy is altogether bad or ineffective, because that is not the case at all. It is a much more nuanced and messy concept than therapy helps everybody solve all their problems, which is kind of where the mental health awareness movement went for a minute there, still kind of is. There's still like a everybody needs therapy all the time energy in society. If anything, I would argue that this is a reasonable course correct. Yeah, also video description. I'm a white person with light brown shoulder length curly hair. I am wearing a burnt sienna dark orange t-shirt and have a white button-up open on top that has like light blue and navy blue and pink and golden flecks and stuff all over it. And I'm sitting in front of a blank wall that has leaves on it. I don't remember if I said that already, but I just said it now. So the plan today is to talk about what capitalism is and how it relates to disability, to sort of expand our view of particularly mental disability, but also disability in general, and then talk about the models of disability, talk about diagnoses and therapeutic methods as tools of oppression, how therapy impacts individual and collective humanity, and then talk about some of the bright side stuff, i.e. what we can do to try to make it more effective as a tool, and how we can approach these things in the future. Awesome. For the capitalism and disability section, I'm gonna just pull a clip from my Sweeney Todd video of all places because I really like the explanation and like why try to rewrite the same thing with less good wording a second time around when I can just reuse a clip. So here you go. Brief history of disability. Disabled as a category was created to group who was capable of working efficiently and who was not. Those who could not were considered the deserving poor, i.e. they can get aid from the government, and those who could were required to work. That's a very simple explanation. There's also the fact that disabled rich folks or older folks could be paid to be taken care of, so there's some privilege there, and not all people worked. The general definition also kind of carried over in the sense of like, if you as a woman refuse to get married, you are therefore insane and should be put into a madhouse as well. So we see a lot of that. In times of economic prosperity, usually directly after major wars, the disability category typically increases in size, and that more things legally count as disability and more resources are given out because we want to support veterans to get more people to enlist in the military. This is a lot less of a thing that we see in recent history, but it definitely was a thing after World War I and World War II. In times of economic hardship, like right now, the category drastically decreases despite the same amount of people struggling. So when it comes to the era we were talking about in this show where workhouses and madhouses were overrun and there were too many people in the cities and not enough places or jobs for them and no resources for anybody, that category was very, very small. But getting back to the concept of madness, which we can also describe as neurodivergence or mental disability, I go with the verbiage of the era here, so I'm using madness. What we categorize as mentally ill is often person is unable to do precisely what we want them to and the way that we want them to do it. We need to administer care so that they can be able to do the thing that we want them to do in the most productive and efficient way possible. Like, yes, it is disabling in the sense of like mental illness has a lot of distressing experiences involved in it. It does prevent me from living my life in the way that I want to sometimes. So getting care to learn coping mechanisms and whatnot is important and helpful. So I'm not saying that mental disabilities aren't also impairments that are like actively impairing life. But what I am saying is that mental illness has historically been used as a coercive tool. For example, drapetomania, I don't know if I pronounced that right, but was a mental disease coined in 1851 by Samuel Cartwright that afflicted slaves by making them want to run away from slavery, and they were mentally ill because why would a slave want to leave slavery? We have many diagnoses in the DSM that are parallel to each other, but one is used primarily for people of color and the other is primarily for white people. We also have the same situation with disorders for men versus women. And also, like, even today, I've seen countless stories of folks being referred to psychologists to learn to deal with their COVID anxiety because it's getting in the way of life life, as if that's not like a very legitimate concern to currently have for very many people. Looking at mental illness as a social construct does not mean that these experiences are not real, but rather that they do not constitute a fixed or objective category across time and space. Like race, like gender, like all illness and other forms of deviance from the norm, the concept of madness and mental illness have been molded in a particular social, political, and economic context, and would look different in a liberated future. That's from the book Mad World. I have it here, The Politics of Mental Health. I'm only part way through it right now, but it's fantastic and I highly recommend it. It basically talks about how capitalism is what is causing the vast majority of mental illness and how we need to look at these concepts more broadly and acknowledge the context in which they find themselves. For me, I try to look at mental disability in reverse. I firmly believe that neurotypical people are not a real thing. They do not exist. I will link my video about that up here. And I go into every single interaction with people that I meet assuming they're neurodivergent unless proven otherwise, which has never been proven otherwise, and interact with people from that level of understanding instead. Absolute life changer. Highly recommend if you struggle with social cues and social situations. This helps with anxiety a lot, I found. But yeah, the point here is that capitalism and wider social norms are the overarching mechanisms that decide who is mad and who is not. And more specifically, that people in power are usually the ones who decide that. I also want to add that like when it comes to the origins of mental disabilities, it does very much have obviously biological factors involved, we know this, but how our body minds behave is also inextricably linked to our environment and are also more flexible than we often think. It's correlation versus causation. Like just because a brain difference and a certain set of symptoms seem to happen at the same time does not necessarily mean that the biology entirely caused the experience or that the experience entirely caused the biology. It's a combination situation. A great way to look at this is with the minority stress model attributed to a 2003 paper titled Prejudice, Social Stress, and Mental Health in Lesbian, Gay, and Bisexual Populations, Conceptual Issues and Research Evidence by Alon H. Meyer, that discussed how prejudice, discrimination, stigma, and the burden of wider social issues on minority groups, in this case the queer community, causes statistical increase in mental health problems. There have since been other papers connecting this phenomenon to many other minority groups. I know I learned about this model in a racial context initially, with further research acknowledging that minority groups are more likely to live at or below the poverty line, that folks who are more likely to live at or below the poverty line are more likely to have things like lead exposure, have less access to healthy food and clean drinking water, etc., which can also create adverse health effects, which then makes instances of disability and mental illness higher in more marginalized populations. So it's like environment plus treatment plus a whole lot of other things. When it comes to disability, we primarily look at two models. We have the medical model that says, this is the problem with you and it's making your life worse and we need to fix it. And the social model says, this is an issue with the world not being accessible to you, you are perfect as you are, and it is the world that needs to be fixed to accommodate you. Most people in the community, we kind of tend to lean somewhere in the middle of these two in our approaches, acknowledging that our struggles are the world being directly hostile towards people like us, but also sometimes our body mind don't do what we want them to, and we do feel impaired, and sometimes that gets in the way of our lives. And we may want to seek treatment, we may want to feel better, and that is okay. It just doesn't mean that our lives are any less than or less worth living than anybody else, which is like the difference between we need to cure you, you're perfect as you are, and hey, some of this is hard and you deserve support and to feel better if you want to, but also a lot of what's hard is your surroundings and not you, if that makes sense. Now, unsurprisingly, the field of psychiatry tends to work in the medical model because it's medical. We expect it to operate like you have a problem, you go to a therapist, they find you a solution, and then out the door you go back into life. But what do you do when your anxiety disorder getting in the way of your life is the fact that 1,500 Americans are dying of COVID every week, or the climate crisis, or more genocides than we can count going on right now, or the economic crisis, or the fact that most people I know have put in 100 job applications and heard back from none of them, or that we feel like we have to monetize our hobbies to survive and spend all of our time working for money with no free time in order to just barely scrape by under late-stage capitalism, because I feel like maybe being stressed all the time is a perfectly reasonable response to that. We know that elevated depressive symptoms are at 3 times the levels today they were pre-pandemic, but also like, who is surprised? This seems very logical to me. But back to the medical model. The idea of what is normal and abnormal under the medical model with physical medicine is incredibly complicated and biased toward the people who created those fields in the Western world, primarily cis white men. But I think there also is a general consensus that like having a bone popping out of your leg or having cancer is maybe a problem. But when it comes to like how much period pain is normal, things get really misogynistic and often racist real quickly. So when it comes to what is normal and abnormal with something so subjective as mental health, things get really messy really quickly, particularly because a whole lot of psychiatry, if not all of it, we could argue that later, was created to easily pathologize people as crazy and unstable as an excuse to get them out of the way, to control them, and to justify literal and structural violence. Even today, all you have to do is call somebody crazy and people quickly stop listening to them. This is a tried and true method. We also direct these things toward people. We teach them that their thoughts are inflated, their nervous systems are overactive, they need to learn how to regulate that, which often ends up as like, hey, if people at your job constantly misgender you or make racist side comments, here's how to take it less personally, ignore your feelings and physiological responses to that, and be more compliant and pleasant to be around. I also read an incredible article by Dr. Aisha Khan, also known as the Woke Scientist. Every one of her articles is incredible, actually, so check out their work. They'll come up throughout this video. But this one in particular is called Decolonizing, Abolishing Bioessentialism and the Neurodivergent Neurotypical Binary, that spoke about how the neurodiversity movement specifically acts like it is accepting different kinds of brains while continuing to categorize them using labels created deliberately to classify and oppress people, and then using those labels to exclude others from their spaces. Neoliberal mental health spaces turn to the same psychiatric diagnoses that pathologize and criminalize our distress for validation. If you Google definitions of neurodiversity or neurodivergent, you will most often see examples that include a list of diagnoses from the DSM-5. While the original goal may have been to look at these categories as alternative brain functions that don't need to be treated, the kicker is that we cannot restrict ourselves to labels given to us by oppressors to make total sense of our struggles. Psychiatric diagnoses were created to pathologize people's logical responses to stress from surviving under oppressive systems, rebelling and diverging from dominant colonial capitalist standards of traits arbitrarily framed as normal. I do think this is a bit complicated because we do have other minorities also based on arbitrary categories that are also not backed up by the most ethical, consistent, and or accurate science that deserve affinity spaces as well, so why not carry that across to mental disability? But I do think that this is an interesting sentiment that still stands and is definitely something to ponder, particularly because the main idea of this is that alternative approaches to mental health beyond neurodiversity exist, and thus the presence or absence of a self-identifier shouldn't preclude people from accessing neurodivergent spaces. Khan also has another article that we will discuss more later called The Global Expansion. We don't discuss this more later. That's a lie. I meant to discuss it more later and then it didn't go into the flow of the script. But it's great, read it. It's called The Global Expansion of Psychiatry is Modern Colonialism and the Global South is Pushing Back, about how not only is Western psychiatry furthering colonialism here, but also bringing these concepts to other cultures, often collectivist cultures that do not emphasize identity labels, and how that is modern colonialism. And that many folks in collectivist communities, often communities of color, therefore do not connect to these labels in the same way that others do, and are therefore shut out of neurodivergent spaces, and that the academicness of the way that the DSM is written is part of white supremacy culture and primarily catered toward white folks in that sense as well. There are also important conversations being had about how the mental health system is part of the wider carceral system. As Shira Hassan says in Saving Our Own Lives, a Liberatory Practice of Harm Reduction, as a neurodivergent psych survivor, I am asking all licensed mental health professionals to at least acknowledge that they occupy a legally empowered position of privilege that is maintained at the cost of putting multiply marginalized people at significant risk of becoming ensnared in some combination of the prison industrial complex, the medical industrial complex, and the family policing system. The connections between prisons, institutions, and mental health care are like a circle, so it's not like the idea of mental health diagnoses being used to lock people up or force people into certain behaviors have gone away at all. But when we talk about therapy as a tool of oppression under capitalism, the biggest thing most people point to is the fact that therapy aims to get people to fulfill a certain level of productivity. It's really focusing on the root causes behind why a person might be experiencing what they're experiencing, but rather short-term change and survival tools to be able to get you back onto the hamster wheel that is life. And something that I saw or read somewhere, I researched a lot for this, talked about how it's like putting a band-aid on a bullet wound, which I think encapsulates this quite nicely. I think there is something to be said about the fact that some people genuinely feel that the way that they are interacting with the world is getting in the way of them functioning the way that they wanted to. I know a younger me went to therapy because I kept having panic attacks, and so I learned tools how to soothe myself when they started so I could stop them rather than the end of said panic attack be when I got too dizzy that I passed out and then the panic attack was over because I was no longer conscious. Great to not to have to do that anymore. Were a lot of those panic attacks probably caused by capitalistic expectations and the unrealistic pressure that we put on very young people? Probably. But either way, those skills are important and they helped me a lot to be able to get to a place where I could start to unravel the root causes beneath why I was feeling that way. Though in all honesty, unraveling most of those root causes did happen outside of therapy for me. But like, yes, the system is primarily structured on how can we solve your problem as quickly as possible, slap a band-aid on it to get you functioning under capitalism the way that is best for you and for the system as a whole rather than taking the time and energy to really unpack everything. but it also gets people from being miserably adrift to some sort of survival mode, and that's kind of the primary option that we have right now within the messed up structural system that we live in, and I can't deny that that's not, like, important, right? Like, that is an inherently important thing that we are doing. But the thing where I take the most issue is when it's you're acting irrationally and you need to reframe your thoughts, you need to be less reactive, your thoughts are inflated because, like, have you seen the state of the universe? There's a quote that's like, insanity is a perfectly rational response to an insane world, or something like that. And there's like something deeply freaky to me about the fact that we look at people going, hi, everything's bad and it's making it hard to be a person. And we go, no, it's not. You're just overreacting. It's getting in the way of you being able to work. Here are some options on how to fix that so you can get back to doing what you want to do. In my video where I talked about why talk therapy can often be ineffective for autistic people, we talked about how a lot of cognitive behavioral therapy is learning to reframe irrational thoughts, when for many marginalized people, the thoughts their therapist may tell them are irrational are very much realities for them. And by being forced to reframe them, they're being trained that the way that they feel is incorrect and irrational, and learning to fundamentally ignore the things that their body mind is trying to tell them. I know that I spent years trying to intellectualize my way out of anxiety because I was told that that was causing my migraines, but then I would just get anxious about migraines and then I would get the migraines anyway. So it took like listening to my body and what it was telling me and trying to honor that and work with that to try to get to a point where I don't really get them anymore. I would also mention that, like, a specific example of this for me was with my thesis that fell apart in the most dramatic way possible, where I kept having moments where I was like panicking about something and I was like, oh my gosh, they haven't emailed me back for this long, it means that we're gonna lose everything. And everybody would be like, no, like, you're being over dramatic, it's probably fine that they haven't emailed you back in a week, like, it's totally okay. And then like the next day I would get an email that would like remove another part of my thesis. And I was like, okay, well, I tried to reframe my thoughts and then I was proved correct, so this is just gonna make it worse down the line. And that like continuously kept happening to me until I was like, I'm not spiraling out of control. The world is spiraling out of control and I'm responding reasonably. And I think that a lot of that happens for a lot of people, and other people try to help by being like, no, it's not that bad. And it's like, no, it is that bad though. It definitely is that bad. The other thing I mentioned in that video was that the idea of like, you can stop panic moments by reframing your thinking isn't super effective for a lot of people, because the primary thing when we panic is that our thinking becomes really rigid, and so the idea of framing it differently is very stressful on its own. I would argue that a whole lot of practicing can help with this. Like, I know that if I'm panicking at 11 p.m. it's because I'm really tired and things always look better in the morning, so it's time to go to bed. I couldn't do that when I was younger. I would just spiral out of control. So I'm not saying that is entirely useless. I'm just saying that there's some give and take there. The other thing with therapy that is often discussed is how deeply individualistic it is, and will either blame you for your problems and say only you can fix them, or it'll say you're a victim, everybody else is the cause of your problems, and there's seemingly no in between, causing some people to leave therapy feeling dismissed and defective and broken, and others to feel validated to an unhelpfully egotistical level, primarily because treatment is in complete isolation from the rest of your surroundings, and so the coping skills that you get often involve focusing on your own happiness and what you need and completely disregarding others, which, yes, some level of taking care of yourself is important. But because of how therapy is structured, it can often overcorrect that all the way into the other direction. Like, your therapist only gets a very teeny tiny window into your life, and they only get it through the lens of you. So if you're frustrated with your best friend and complain about them in every single appointment, the therapist may just go, hey, seems like this person really bothers you and makes you miserable. Have you considered not hanging out with them anymore? Therapy is deliberately structured to make you feel validated, and in order to have a good client-therapist relationship, a therapist needs to connect with their client. And also, in order to get you to talk about the things that you really struggle with deep down and get into the depths of how you see the world, you need to really trust each other, which makes the therapist typically biased in a client's direction, because they want to root for you. They want you to do better in your life, and they want to help you do that. That is their job. To quote Dr. Devon Price, therapy at its best provides close social connection with training wheels. It gives you a space to have support and dialogue without fear of rejection, and they give you the tools that you can practice there and then feel safer to use in real interactions outside of the office. They can make you feel like somebody in the world has your back and can help you a lot with confidence and recentering and advocating for yourself. And many therapists also know when to challenge their clients a little bit, but at the end of the day, they only meet you for so many days a year and so many hours of those days that they meet you, and they don't know everybody in your life, so they don't have the full context. And so they may tell you, based on the story that you told, that you were correct and you did all the right things, when in reality you were in the wrong, you hurt someone, you're being unrealistic about a situation, etc. That doesn't mean that they're bad at their job, it's just the nature of how therapy is structured. I've had several friends in my life who I've lovingly pointed out consistent patterns of behavior that have been hurting their quality of life, and they've been like, oh my gosh, why didn't my therapist notice that? And then they bring that wording that I gave them back to their therapist and suddenly get a lot more tools to help them in life. Their therapists aren't failing them, they're just not getting the chance to see this person interact with their surroundings. I watch these people every day, I figure out their patterns of behavior, and I point them out to them. Because that's what I do. But like, that's not possible for somebody who's not seeing you in your environment actively. And this can also cause problems in reverse, because then the person goes to interact with their surroundings outside of therapy and doesn't actually have a full picture of what's going on because their therapist who gave them the advice doesn't have a full picture of what's going on. Within the one-sided confines of therapy, abruptly giving a loved one the silent treatment can be framed as protecting your boundaries. Asking other people to never say or do anything that triggers your anxieties can be viewed as speaking your truth. And ruthlessly keeping score of every time a partner disappoints you can be cast as validating your reality and protecting yourself from future heartbreak. There's almost no behavior a person can't justify with the support of a therapist and the right self-help language. We've talked about the weaponization of therapy speak and HRification of relationships on this channel before as well. I would link it above for you. But the idea of you need to be more selfish and you don't owe anybody anything, and if people make you feel bad, cut them out of your life, has kind of spiraled out of control a little bit. Like, yes, you don't technically owe anybody anything, but I personally think that basic human decency is a great thing to give people. Maybe that's just me, but like, oh, you don't owe anybody anything just has been used to justify some not so great things. Quite often, a therapist will unwittingly find themselves reinforcing a client's most negative perceptions of other people and encouraging them to engage in stubborn, one-sided behaviors that push others away. I mostly reside in the neurodivergent and queer communities where statistically almost everybody's in therapy, and I've been seeing a significant increase lately in people having one tiny conflict come up in a relationship, and rather than have a conversation about it, work it out, you know, try to, I don't know, acknowledge the amount of time you spent with a person and how that was maybe significant and important and this person was a part of your life for a long time and people mess up sometimes. People are just cutting people off with no explanation, often after years of being very close friends, and then feeling proud of themselves for having done that, which is just wild to me. And it also has carried across to like how we treat people we don't even know on the internet. I made a video about that up here that we talked about a few weeks ago. I'm gonna run out of cards. This is another one of those conglomeration videos where I talk about everything I've ever spoken about in this channel. But seriously, so many people in the queer and neurodivergent communities are all like, I'm anti-capitalism and I'm an activist and I do activist work, and then handle relationships in the most selfish, individualistic way possible. And I don't understand how those two things can happen at the same time. I don't get, I mean, I'm also hypocritical. Humans are inherently hypocritical, and me critiquing this makes me feel hypocritical because I'm sure I do the same thing and don't notice it. But I'm trying, right? Like, we're all trying, but like, what is happening with the breakdown of human communication? This also ties into like protecting your peace and the institution of self-care, which we frame as resistance, but it's also deeply individualistic and focused on how you can do something for yourself in complete isolation from everybody else around you, often involving buying yourself a little treat, which is the exact opposite of resisting capitalism. And also, our well-being is inherently attached to the well-being of the people and the nature and the community around us, and it's impossible for us to care entirely for ourselves because every single thing that we do, every place that we go, everything we eat and we wear, all of this is because of other beings, whether human or animal or plant. We are inherently interconnected. So the idea of self-care being somehow separating yourself from all of that is kind of a fallacy at best, in all honesty, which brings us into the conversation of community and humanity, because therapy has become a sort of, if you're not in therapy, it's a red flag situation, or like you need to love yourself before people can love you, or you need to pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Those things have all become identical phrases. And I've heard countless people talk about how they've been accused of trauma dumping when having a normal conversation about their life as a marginalized individual with other people, as if sharing the struggles of your life is not what human connection primarily is. And I've told people about my history before and have been told, wow, that's awful. Have you tried talking to somebody about that? Like, yes. I went to therapy. And did it change the circumstances of my situation? No. And also, I'm talking to you, my friend, about it because friends support each other, and that's how that works. So, you know, even if I was dealing with my struggles with a therapist, Relying solely on one person to guide you in life and support you is never a good idea, ever. That also includes partners. That includes your one best friend who's the only person that you talk to. Like, have a web of community of many people that you can go to for support. That is how humans are supposed to function. And frankly, relying solely on one person ever, who you only see for an hour every other week, is probably not the greatest idea in comparison to the friend that you've been texting all day, every day for who knows how long. Hello to my core 4, you know who you are. But the idea of ascribing moral judgment to therapy is also concerning because for many people, the therapeutic system is not safe for them or accessible to them. Their insurance may not cover it. They may not be able to afford it. They may have been a victim of the system before and no longer feel safe within it. Hey, they may not have been able to find a therapist that they vibe with because there are significantly less therapists in various minority groups, particularly in the realms of disabled and BIPOC experiences. At the end of the day, therapy is just a tool in a larger ecosystem of support of lots of different things that people rely on, and having a therapist does not make you a better or more well-regulated person than somebody who does not have one. Like, speaking about what we talked about earlier in regards to well-regulated, therapy does not make you an inherently better person, and it can sometimes make you a worse one if you don't do it right. So let's pivot into a little bit of positivity to finish this video, because yes, as the great Audre Lorde once said, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house, but they might be able to, like, crack a window, right? Like, yes, therapy's built on some sketchy foundations and has serious issues, but also it is your care for you, and you can push it in the direction that you need that care to go. The issue is that we often don't always have the language to help us to push it in that direction. So hopefully this can give you some of that. The primary sources for this section are going to be Dr. Devin Price's Substack article, How to Get the Most Out of Therapy, and Mickey Atkins' video, Does Capitalism Make Therapy Useless? Therapists Talk Socialism, Capitalism, and Mental Illness. Both incredible. Check them both out. Again, linked in the description. Some things they recommend include being really picky about who you work with. If you don't connect with your therapist or they hold completely different ideals from you, they're not going to be super helpful. Mickey's video has a bunch of resources in the description for finding BIPOC and otherwise inclusive therapists local to you, so you should definitely check that out if you are seeking one. Also, do the homework that your therapist gives you, even if it sounds pointless. Think of them like your personal trainer giving you a workout plan. You may not totally understand why they're making you do jumping jacks, or like those stupid things when you're in physical therapy and they make you like stand there and then like move one muscle for 5 minutes and you're like, this is the dumbest thing ever, but it actually really helps in the long run. They know what they're doing. There's a reason for it. Just trust them. Also, try to take the time to unpack the things in life that you feel like you must or you have to do. Figure out what makes you feel helpless and hopeless and see what you can maybe take some control over. Unpack the idea that productivity equals worth and come up with tools to use your time and energy better so that you can devote more of it to the things that you want to do. I also have a video on economizing energy that you can watch in the link above. It's really great, really helpful. Mickey described this specifically as being similar to unpacking and unlearning things from abusive and unhealthy relationships. Just in this case, the abuser is of course capitalism, which you're not wrong. Make sure also that you talk about the things that make you uncomfortable to talk about. Say the things that you're feeling, even if you think it might make you seem like a bad person. Acknowledge where you messed up. They can't support you in your real life because they don't see it, but you can help them see it better by being fully honest about where you're at. And that's gonna make them more likely to be actually helpful to you. Also, tell them when the advice they're giving you is bad. Like if they keep trying to tell you to cut out somebody in your life and you're not comfortable with that, say something about it. If therapy is social interaction with training wheels, use it as a time to practice setting boundaries and being honest and saying, hey, that makes me uncomfortable, or hey, I feel like I'm not allowed to feel my feelings here, and I think intellectualizing them further together isn't helping me. You're paying them to support you, so get the support that you need. They're not going to be mad at you. I promise. This is their job. The last bit is to supplement what you're learning in therapy with outside reading. I got on a serious self-help book kick a few years ago. How very undiagnosed autism of me. It was great. Definitely choose ones by people who seem to know what they're talking about. Usually choosing ones with a lot of positive reviews and also by a doctor are going to be your best bet. Maybe Google said person to see what they do, but like a lot of the people I've sourced in this video as well have books and they're incredible. Specifically Dr. Devin Price, his work is fantastic, so you should definitely check them out. But also, if general community care makes you feel stable and supported and other tools work better for you than being one-on-one in a therapist's office, there's nothing wrong with that at all. As long as you feel like you are able to do your best to be the you that you want to be and live the life that you want to live within the constraints of a messed up system that controls everything, obviously, you're doing wonderfully. That's it. There's no like there's no moral code. Going to therapy does not make you a more moral or better person. I think overall this is a tough but also deeply interesting and important discussion to be had, because I know that I've been consistently told by acquaintances that I'm weird for not going to therapy anymore. And when I explained that, I'm like, I have a really good support system, and if I have a panic moment, it's because of something in the world around me that I don't have control over. It has nothing to do with my coping mechanisms, and I also, like, didn't have a good time in the medical system, so I can't relax in a therapist's office. And that's something that I could unpack with a therapist, but, like, that's a lot of steps. And I'm doing fine, and I'm, like, stable, and I'm content. And people just look at me weird when I say that. And I once had somebody explain to me for 3 hours straight that I was fundamentally wrong for not spending all of my time trying to find a therapist that worked for me because it would make me a better person. And I kept telling them that's not how therapy works in the slightest, and they got increasingly angry at me, and it was really bizarre. Like, it was so weird. Again, this is not anti-therapy at all. Like, it's an important tool. It's just here's a more nuanced look at it. If you felt alienated by the system, you aren't alone in that conversation that I hope was somewhat helpful. Hopefully gives you some things to think about going forwards. Maybe it will help make therapy more effective for you in the future. I hope that for you. Yeah, also if you want to learn some therapy tools in a way where you don't have to interact directly with it, if that makes it more accessible to you, the YouTube channels Mickey Atkins and Cinema Therapy are both really great resources that I very much enjoy. They help me a lot with, like, learning socio-emotional language and stuff like that, so I do recommend them. I've otherwise linked all my sources below. Please check them out. They're wonderful, particularly Woke Scientist and Devin Price. The two of them always push my brain forward in brain scratchy directions, and I love them for that. And let me know what you think of all this in the comments, but also please be kind because this was very controversial of a topic to cover. You're also welcome to like and subscribe if you want, no pressure. And as always, thank you for listening. Thank you for learning. Remember, it's never too late to start over, and I look forward to seeing you, my dear, in the next one.